On the afternoon of April the 1st, 1922, in a villa called Quinta do Monte in the hills above Funchal, Madeira, a man of 34 was dying in a bedroom where the walls were damp and the shutters rattled in the Atlantic wind. His wife sat beside him. She was 29 years old and pregnant with their 8th child. 7 others were in the next room, the eldest 9, the youngest not yet 1, held quiet by governesses who had followed the family from one country to the next and who now had nothing to do but wait. A chaplain administered the last rites. The doctors stood back. The man who had been, 4 years earlier, the emperor of a state of 50 million people died in a borrowed house on a Portuguese island, attended by a household that could no longer afford the hotel down the hill. His wife closed his eyes. She did not collapse. She began arranging the funeral. The world had once known her as the woman beside the Habsburg throne, the name that had governed Central Europe for 6 centuries, the family whose palaces and protocol and Catholic grandeur had seemed as permanent as the continent itself. The public remembered the fall. They did not know what came after: the rented villas, the pawned jewelry, the children raised in exile as though the empire still existed, the women left to carry everything the men had lost. This is the story of the Habsburg princesses after the empire collapsed. 8 children scattered across 7 decades and half a dozen countries, and the mother in black who held them together. The public version ended with a fallen throne. The real story is what happened when the women were left to carry the ruins. But to understand how a woman who had once been crowned empress of one of Europe's oldest dynasties ended up burying her husband on an Atlantic island she could barely afford to live on, you have to go back. Not just to the war, not just to the abdication, that was never quite an abdication, but to the world that made Zita, and to the centuries of inherited certainty that made her loss so total when it came. This is the story of a family that ruled Central Europe for more than 600 years and spent the next century watching its women carry the ruins. It is the story of daughters, widows, mothers, and exiles across Switzerland, Madeira, Spain, Belgium, Quebec, and New York, and what the name Habsburg cost every one of them. The name itself was once a kind of geography. To say Habsburg in the early 20th century was not merely to name a family, it was to invoke an order of things, a political architecture so deeply embedded in the map of Europe that removing it required a world war and even then left a phantom shape behind. The dynasty had held Austria since 1282. After 1526, it held the crowns of Hungary and Bohemia as well. At its height, through marriage and inheritance and the slow patience of dynastic accumulation, the House of Habsburg had touched nearly every major throne in Europe. Spain, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire. The family's reach had once stretched so far that the phrase attributed to the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus became something close to a dynasty motto: "Let others wage war. Thou happy Austria marry." By the time the first modern cameras captured the family at court, Schönbrunn gleaming in the summer light, the Hofburg heavy with winter ceremonial, the Habsburgs had been accumulating territory, titles, and legitimacy for so long that their presence felt less like political power and more like weather. They were simply there, and the assumption that they would always be there was not vanity. It was the emotional foundation on which the family raised its children, married its daughters, and organized every detail of its enormous ritualistic, devotional daily life. That assumption is what makes the women's story so devastating. Because the wealth of the Habsburgs did not arrive in the manner of a British industrial fortune or an American banking empire, built by one generation of risk and genius and passed to the next through wills and trust. It accumulated across centuries of hereditary rule, embedded in crown lands, court institutions, military establishments, and a constitutional arrangement that made the distinction between what belonged to the state and what belonged to the family extraordinarily difficult to disentangle. The Hofburg was not a private home in any straightforward sense. Schönbrunn was not a country estate one could sell if times grew hard. The income that sustained the imperial household flowed not from investments or rents in the British aristocratic manner, but from the machinery of sovereignty itself. The crown lands, the state budget, the institutional apparatus of an empire that encompassed over 50 million people across a dozen languages. When that sovereignty ended, the machinery stopped. There was no portfolio of stocks to fall back on, no family trust managed by solicitors in a quiet London office. The jewels were not personal ornament alone. They existed in a contested space between dynastic private and crown property that would matter brutally after 1918 when the new Austrian Republic moved to claim everything it could reach: the carriages, the silver, the art, the libraries, the residences themselves. All of it belonged to a system where dynastic authority and state apparatus had grown together for 6 centuries, intertwined so completely that separating them would require not merely a legal process, but a kind of surgery. That surgery arrived in the form of the Habsburg Law of 1919, which stripped the family of crown-related property, transferred major holdings to the state, and left the private assets that remained contested, fragmented, and often impossible to access from exile. The law did not merely impoverish the family, it dismantled the economic ecosystem that had sustained their existence. And it would leave the women stripped of nearly everything that had made their life possible, while leaving them burdened with everything that had made their life a performance. There is something about the Habsburg family code that you have to understand before the story can continue. It was not merely aristocratic in the manner of the English peerage, where wealth and title conferred privilege, but remained fundamentally secular arrangements. The Habsburg code was sacral. The family understood its authority as flowing from God through the dynasty to the peoples it governed, a covenant renewed through Catholic devotion, dynastic marriage, and the visible performance of faith in every public and private act. Court ritual was not spectacle for its own sake. It was theology made physical, the hierarchy of the household mirroring the hierarchy of creation, the emperor standing as God's representative, the empress standing beside him as the embodiment of Catholic motherhood and dynastic continuity. The family prayed together. They observed feast days, saints' days, the liturgical calendar in its fullness. They understood suffering not as misfortune, but as divine testing, and endurance not as stubbornness, but as fidelity to a covenant that no earthly parliament had the authority to dissolve. For the women, this covenant had a particular shape that would define their lives long after the empire was gone. The men inherited the political symbolism, the crowns, the military commands, the diplomatic weight, the public ceremonies of sovereignty. The women inherited the labor of making that symbolism habitable. They ran the households. They bore and raised the heirs. They maintained the religious observances that gave the dynasty its moral architecture. They managed the servants, the governesses, the chaplains, the schoolrooms, the menus, the wardrobes, the sick rooms, and the daily texture of a life lived always in service to something larger than any individual feeling. Their personal desires were not forbidden exactly, but they were understood to be subordinate to the dynasty's needs. A Habsburg woman did not choose her life. She inhabited the life the dynasty required. And when the dynasty fell, that training did not disappear. It became the only tool the women had left. The key properties of the imperial world should be understood almost as a sequence of shrinking rooms, because that is what the women would experience in the years ahead. First, the old imperial scale, the Hofburg in the center of Vienna, with its 2,600 rooms and its staff of hundreds, the seat of Habsburg power since the 13th century. Then Schönbrunn, the summer palace, its 1,441 rooms stretching across formal gardens that had been laid out to demonstrate the family's mastery of nature itself. These were not merely residences. They were the physical expression of a political theology. The idea that the Habsburg family and the land it governed were one and the same thing. After 1918, the women would watch that scale contract with devastating speed. From Schönbrunn to Eckartsau, a hunting lodge in Lower Austria. From Eckartsau to Warteg, near Lake Constance, a borrowed villa. From Warteg to Prengens on Lake Geneva, because the Swiss government wanted them farther from the Austrian border. From Prengens, eventually, to Madeira, a Reed's Palace Hotel, which they could not afford, and then Quinta do Monte, where Karl would die. Each move was a material reduction. Each move was a message. And the women were the ones who packed the trunks, dressed the children, maintained the forms of address, and pretended that the next place would be temporary. To understand the woman at the center of this saga, you have to understand where she came from, and what she had already been taught about loss before she ever set foot inside a Habsburg palace. Zita was born on May the 9th, 1892, not into the Habsburg line itself, but into the House of Bourbon-Parma, a dynasty that had its own long, intimate education in dispossession. Her father, Robert, Duke of Parma, had lost his Italian duchy in 1859 during the Wars of Unification. Her mother, Maria Antonia, was a Portuguese infanta from the House of Braganza, a royal line that had itself weathered revolution and exile. Zita grew up in a household that moved between residences in Italy and Austria. The villa at Pianori in Tuscany, the castle at Schwarzau am Steinfeld in Lower Austria, a childhood landscape of properties that testified to former sovereignty without delivering present power. She spoke Italian, French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and English, not because she was a prodigy, but because her family needed to survive across borders. She absorbed Catholic devotion, not as ornament, but as the one constant in a world where political authority had proved impermanent. And she learned from her mother and from the wider culture of displaced Catholic royalty that surrounded her childhood a particular emotional discipline that would define her entire life: the art of maintaining dignity after the state that had justified it was gone. That formation would prove to be the most consequential inheritance Zita ever received. Long before she became empress, she had been raised among people who understood what it meant to carry a dynastic name without a dynasty. She knew the architecture of proud displacement, the household that still observed its own hierarchy, the children still educated as though restoration were imminent, the adults still addressed by titles that corresponded to nothing on any current map. She had watched her own mother perform this labor. She would later reproduce it almost exactly for her own children, in exile, across decades, and the pattern was already in her bones. And it was Maria Antonia, that quiet, devout, enduring presence, who had placed it there. The elder world that taught Zita how not to collapse, how to keep the architecture of a vanished court standing inside a rented room. That teaching would be tested beyond anything Maria Antonia could have imagined. Karl was different. Born on August the 17th, 1887, Archduke Karl Franz Joseph was not originally expected to inherit the throne. He was the grandnephew of the aged Emperor Franz Joseph, positioned far enough from the direct line of succession that his childhood had a slightly less pressurized quality than it might otherwise have carried. He grew up at properties in Lower Austria, was educated by tutors who emphasized Catholic theology and dynastic duty, and was trained for military service in the manner expected of a Habsburg archduke. Seriously, but without the relentless preparation that would have attended a designated heir. He was fond of the outdoors, conventionally devout, and temperamentally inclined toward quiet rather than display. Then the bullet at Sarajevo in June 1914 killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man who had been expected to succeed Franz Joseph, and suddenly Karl found himself heir presumptive to an empire at war. When Franz Joseph died in November 1916, worn out at 86 by the sheer duration of his reign and the grief of a dynasty that had already lost too many of its members to violence and scandal, Karl became emperor. He was 29 years old. He inherited not a stable throne, but a disintegrating one, and he inherited it in the middle of the worst war in European history. He was sincere, religious, serious rather than theatrical, and by every account that survives, he was a man who wanted peace more than he wanted glory. He attempted secret negotiations with the Allies through Zita's brother Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, an effort rooted in genuine conviction that the war must end, but one that, when it became public in what the press called the Sixtus Affair of 1918, damaged him politically and irreparably. The exposure painted both Karl and Zita as disloyal to their own German allies. It deepened suspicion of Zita's influence. Critics had always resented the idea that an empress of Bourbon-Parma blood might be shaping imperial policy, and it left the couple politically isolated at precisely the moment when they could least afford it. Karl was not a weak man, but he was a man whose qualities, conscience, piety, a genuine preference for negotiation of a force, were poorly suited to the catastrophe he had inherited. He enters this story not as its true protagonist, but as the event that created the women's fate. Everything that happened to Zita, to the daughters, to the household that would carry the Habsburg name across borders and decades, flowed from what Karl lost and what Karl left behind. His mother, Archduchess Maria Josepha of Saxony, carried an older thread of the same pattern. She had married into the Habsburg line, lived through the long, increasingly brittle twilight of Franz Joseph's reign, absorbed the court's rhythms and expectations so completely that they became indistinguishable from her own character, and she followed her son into exile when the end came. Her significance in this story is not dramatic, but structural. She was the elder woman presence that linked the old court world to the exile household, the living proof that the family's culture did not begin or end with any single generation. In the years ahead, when the household was reduced and displaced and stripped of every external support, Maria Josepha's bearing would serve as a kind of emotional scaffolding. She prayed, she maintained her posture, she taught by the simple fact of her continued presence that collapse was something one endured in silence, not something one discussed. It was a particular kind of strength. It was also a particular kind of imprisonment. Then there were the children, and it is the children, above all the daughters, whose trajectories would come to define what the Habsburg name actually meant in the 20th century. Otto the eldest, born in 1912 at the Hofburg itself, was the heir on whom the vanished monarchy could be projected. He was 2 years old when the war began, 4 when his father became emperor, and 6 when the empire ended. Old enough to register the atmosphere of crisis, the hushed conferences between adults, the changed tone in the household, without understanding its constitutional meaning. By the time he could articulate what had happened, his childhood had already been converted into political symbolism. He was no longer simply the eldest son. He was the crown prince of something that no longer existed. And the weight of that contradiction would press down not only on him, but on every woman who surrounded him. His symbolic burden shaped the family's decisions about where to live, how to travel, what risks to take. Hostile governments watched him. Monarchist supporters projected their hopes onto him. And Zita, who loved her children with a fierce, disciplined devotion, organized much of her widowhood around the project of making Otto legible as the rightful successor. A project that turned every domestic choice into a dynastic calculation and ensured that the women's labor of survival was always shadowed by the men's labor of symbolic continuity. Adelheid, born on January the 3rd, 1914, at Schloss Hetzendorf near Vienna, was old enough to absorb the last atmosphere of the imperial court, the rustle of formal gowns, the click of heels on marble, the incense from the chapel, and young enough to carry that atmosphere into a life the court could never have imagined for her. She was serious by temperament, intellectually curious in a way that the old dynastic expectations would not have rewarded, but that exile made possible. And she carried herself with a quiet intensity that people who met her later in life consistently noted. She would eventually study social and economic sciences, work with a rigor that owed nothing to her title, and teach sociology at Fordham University in New York, a Habsburg archduchess standing before classrooms of American undergraduates, lecturing on social structures that her own family's collapse had taught her to understand from the inside. Her art matters because it represents one mode of female adaptation to dynastic catastrophe. Not marriage into another royal house, not nostalgic withdrawal into a diminished version of the old world, but education, intellectual authority, and professional work. She would become the daughter who answered dispossession by becoming useful on her own terms. But none of that would happen for decades. In 1918, she was 4 years old, and all she knew was that the adults around her were frightened and the rooms kept getting smaller. Charlotte, born on March the 1st, 1921, at Prangens in Switzerland, was the child born already in exile. She never knew the empire as a lived reality. She never saw the Hofburg as home. She never walked through the gardens at Schönbrunn as anything other than a tourist, if she walked through them at all. She knew the empire only as the structure of expectations, silences, and disciplined performances that her mother maintained in every household they occupied. The prayers, the forms of address, the insistence on standards that corresponded to a world that existed only in her mother's memory. Charlotte would later study economics at Laval University in Quebec, work in social welfare in East Harlem under the assumed name Charlotte de Bar, and in 1956 marry Duke Georg of Mecklenburg. Her thread carries extraordinary narrative force because it most directly dramatizes the central contrast of this entire saga. A woman born into one of the grandest dynasties in European history, doing practical, anonymous welfare work in one of New York's poorest neighborhoods, helping families whose problems were as real and immediate as the dynastic concerns she had been raised to carry were abstract. That is not a metaphor. That is a life shaped by the distance between what a name promised and what the world actually required. Elizabeth, born on May the 31st, 1922, was the posthumous child. Born weeks after Karl's death in Madeira, the daughter who would never know her father or the empire or anything except the exile world her mother constructed from memory, will, and the fierce insistence that the family's meaning had not ended with the family's power. She later married Prince Heinrich of Liechtenstein and raised children of her own, building a quiet life that drew its strength not from the dynasty's political claims, but from the domestic endurance her mother had modeled every day of her childhood. Her significance is symbolic as much as biographical. She is the life that began inside the widowhood, that would define the next 7 decades of her mother's existence. The proof that the family went on producing life, went on raising children, went on beginning, even after the political structure that had given all of it its public meaning was utterly gone. Felix and Robert, the younger sons, function in this story as part of the pressure system surrounding the women. They were carried across countries by their mother, schooled according to the same discipline, shaped by the same atmosphere of deferred restoration and enforced dignity. Robert's descendants would later continue a major branch of the family tree. Their presence broadens the story beyond a mother and daughter's narrative into the fuller picture of a displaced court nursery, 8 children, each absorbing the same loss at different ages and in different registers, each slowly becoming an adult in a world that had no throne to offer any of them. What held these people together, and what made their story more than a catalog of titled names, was that each of them wanted something different from the wreckage they shared. Zita wanted continuity, the preservation of the family's meaning across time and geography. Adelheid wanted formation and intellectual seriousness. Charlotte wanted usefulness. Otto wanted, or was told he must want, restoration and responsibility. Elizabeth inherited absence itself. Maria Josepha wanted dignity, preserved in its most austere and unyielding form. These divergent desires are what kept the saga from flattening into one long elegy. They were a family, not a symbol. And the distances between what each of them needed would widen with every year of exile, every border crossed, every household reassembled in another borrowed place. The marriage that set all of it in motion was celebrated at Schwarzau am Steinfeld on October the 21st, 1911. Zita was 19. Karl was 24. By the standards of dynastic alliance, it was unremarkable. 2 members of interconnected Catholic royal houses joining in a union that served lineage and faith in equal measure. The ceremony took place in the castle chapel, with the formalities of rank and precedence governing every aspect of the day. But by every account that survives, what began as duty became something rarer and more fragile, a marriage of genuine affection. Karl and Zita appear in the historical record not as partners in a political arrangement, but as a couple who liked each other, who talked seriously about matters of state and matters of faith, who confided in each other to a degree unusual in dynastic marriages, and who built a domestic world together that was companionate as well as ceremonial. Contemporaries and later biographers alike described the marriage as close, warm, and unusually happy. Karl consulted Zita on political questions. Zita supported Karl's instincts toward peace and reform. They were, in the language of the world they inhabited, a team, and the emotional reality of that partnership would make everything that followed more painful because the loss, when it came, would not be merely institutional. It would be intimate. Children arrived quickly and in number. Otto in 1912, Adelheid in 1914, Robert in 1915, Felix in 1916, Karl Ludwig in 1918, Rudolf in 1919, Charlotte in 1921, Elizabeth posthumously in 1922. 8 children in 11 years, the first born in the stability of Imperial Vienna and the last born after Karl's death on an Atlantic island. The household expanded around them. Governesses for each stage of childhood, a chaplain for daily mass, tutors selected for languages and religious instruction, ladies in waiting who served both practical and ceremonial functions. The whole layered infrastructure of imperial family life assembling itself around a young couple whose genuine warmth gave the institutional machinery its human center. There were nurseries at Schönbrunn and at Hetzendorf. There were walks in the gardens, the bustle of a large family with small children, the domestic noise that even the most formal household cannot entirely suppress. The viewer needs to feel that life before it vanishes, needs to understand that this was not merely a dynasty producing heirs. This was a family, and the destruction of it, with the slow, grinding, decade-long destruction, would cut not just at political ambition, but at the bonds between a mother and the world she had built around her children. The social world of those final years still glittered, at least on its surface. The court calendar turned through its ancient rounds. The household moved between residences according to season and protocol. The rituals of Catholic monarchy, feast days, processions, investitures, the presentation of newborn children to the court, continued to mark time in a way that made the future feel like an extension of the past. Zita's role in this world was public motherhood, visible devotion, and the performance of continuity. She stood beside Karl at state functions in gowns whose construction required weeks of work by the court dressmakers. She received visitors in the formal rooms of the Hofburg, following protocols that had been established before her grandmother was born. She dressed for occasions whose order of precedence was governed by rules so intricate that entire court offices existed to manage them. The daughters were presented, admired, and photographed. The staff moved through their choreographed routines. The priests said Mass in the private chapel. And the household breathed in its old rhythm as if nothing had changed, as if the war raging across the empire's borders were a temporary disturbance rather than the force that would sweep every room they occupied into someone else's hands. But the cracks were already present, and the women were close enough to feel them, even if the public was not. Karl's accession in November 1916 came not in triumph, but in the middle of a war that was tearing his empire apart along its national seams. The Czechs wanted independence. The South Slavs wanted a state of their own. The Hungarians, who had always maintained a separate constitutional identity within the dual monarchy, were growing restless. Food shortages reached even the imperial household, not starvation, not the grinding hunger that ordinary Viennese families endured, but the unmistakable signals that the machinery of provision was failing. The Sixtus affair, when it became public knowledge, was devastating not because the peace effort had been wrong, but because its exposure made the imperial couple look disloyal to their own alliance. The press was merciless. Zita was cast as a meddling foreign consort whose loyalty to her Bourbon-Parma connections outweighed her loyalty to the empire she had married into, a charge that was unfair but politically lethal. Karl's authority, already diminished by the war's unwinnable logic, contracted further, and behind the formal routine of court life, Zita could feel the ground shifting. She was an intelligent woman, politically alert, and she understood before many around her that the cracks were not temporary. The constitutional structure that had sustained the dynasty for 6 centuries was fracturing under pressures it had never been designed to absorb. And beneath the ceremonial surface, the women of the Habsburg household were already living inside something that was ending. To the world, they still looked protected, still looked imperial, still looked as if the old life would continue indefinitely. In private, they were standing on a stage whose floor was giving way beneath them. That world would hold for 2 more years, and then it ended. On November the 11th, 1918, Karl signed a document at Schönbrunn renouncing his participation in affairs of state, and carefully, deliberately, a renunciation crafted to avoid the word abdication, because Zita would not permit it and the family's theology could not accommodate it. When the suggestion of formal abdication was raised, Zita's response, recorded in later accounts with the clarity of a sentence that has been polished by memory but whose core feeling is not in doubt, captured the entire family code in a single breath. A sovereign could be deposed, but abdicate, never. It was magnificent. It was also a refusal to accept the facts as they stood, and that refusal would shape every decision the family made for decades. The household withdrew from Schönbrunn to Schloss Eckartsau, a hunting lodge set in the flat, damp lowlands of the Marchfeld east of Vienna, and there they waited. The old forms persisted inside the lodge's walls. Karl still received visitors with a semblance of protocol. The servants, those who had not already slipped away to find work in the new republic, still used the old titles. The children still moved through their routines, still said their prayers, still wore the clothes that had been packed for them by governesses who maintained their own dignity through the discipline of maintaining the children's. But outside those walls, the state that had made all of it real was gone, dissolved into successor republics that wanted no dynasty and no dynasty's claims. The Habsburg Law was being drafted. The property would be seized. The exile was being arranged. They believed they were waiting out a crisis. They were already living in the afterlife. And the question that none of them could yet answer, the question that would consume the next 70 years of the women's lives, was whether the afterlife could be made to hold any shape at all. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. Eckartsau was never meant to be a home. It was a hunting lodge, built for sport and seasonal occupation, set in the flat marshlands east of Vienna, where the Danube carved its slow, indifferent path through country that had belonged to the Habsburgs for centuries. The rooms were comfortable enough. Paneled walls, stoves against the winter cold, a chapel where the family could hear mass, but the proportions were wrong. After the Hofburg, after Schönbrunn, the lodge felt like a suit cut for someone smaller. The family had arrived in November 1918 with a reduced entourage. Servants who had chosen loyalty over prudence, governesses who stayed because the children needed them, a handful of advisors who still believed the crisis was temporary. The local population was uncertain how to treat them. Some villagers brought food, others stayed away. The new Republican authorities watched from a distance that was not quite hostile and not quite respectful. The uneasy surveillance of people who had not yet decided whether the family at Eckertsau was a political risk or merely an embarrassment. Inside the lodge, the women did what the women would always do in the years ahead. They maintained the household. Zita organized the children's routines with the same discipline she had learned from her own mother in the Bourbon Parma houses of her childhood. Prayers at set hours, meals served properly. The governesses, Countess Gabrielle Bellegarde and Therese von Kersenbrock among them, kept the nursery functioning, the lessons continuing, the daily rhythm of devotion and supervised play holding its shape against the disorder pressing in from outside. Maria Josefa, Karl's mother, maintained her own schedule of prayer and observance with the immovable composure of a woman who had been trained since girlhood to meet calamity with posture rather than complaint. There is something about the Eckartso winter that is worth sitting with for a moment because it established the pattern that would govern the next 7 decades of the women's lives. It was the first time the household's labor of continuity had to be performed without the state machinery that had always supported it. No court office arranged the calendar. No imperial kitchen provisioned the table according to menus developed over centuries. No treasury disbursed funds to pay the servants. The women improvised. They stretched what they had. They maintained appearances not out of vanity, but because appearances were the last structural element holding the family's self-understanding in place. If the governess stopped curtsying, if the children stopped being addressed by their titles, if the daily mass stopped being said in the chapel with the solemnity it had always been given, then the thing the family believed itself to be would begin to dissolve from the inside, and Zita would not permit that dissolution. Not yet, not ever, if she could help it. Karl, through those winter months, remained caught between two postures that could not be reconciled. He had renounced participation in affairs of state, but he had not abdicated, and that distinction, meaningless to the new republic but sacred to the family, kept the door ajar to a future that history had already shut. He received visitors who spoke of restoration. He listened to advisors who told him the successor states were fragile, that the situation was fluid, that Hungary in particular might yet welcome him back. Zita supported this reading of events with a conviction that went deeper than hope. She was not a woman inclined to accept defeat, and her entire formation, the Bourbon Parma childhood among people who had already lost one dynasty and refused to treat the loss as final, the Catholic conviction that legitimate authority flowed from God and could not be surrendered to a parliament or dissolved by a proclamation, pushed her toward the belief that what had been taken could be restored. The theological argument was precise. Sovereignty was a divine trust. A trust could be violated by others, but it could not be voluntarily abandoned by its holder. Therefore, the exile was not a conclusion. It was a trial, a test of faith, and fidelity required the family to behave as though the trial would end in vindication. This conviction sustained the household. It also prevented the household from adapting to reality. Every day that Karl and Zita maintained the posture of temporary displacement was a day that the children absorbed the expectation of return, and a day that the practical business of building a new life was deferred. The money that Karl had been able to bring out of Austria, including the railway wagons of furniture and art, provided some buffer, but liquid income was another matter entirely. A proposed annual settlement from the Austrian state had been discussed and never implemented. The crown jewels were contested. The family's finances, which under the old system had been sustained by the machinery of sovereignty itself, were now dependent on a combination of personal assets, aristocratic charity, and the hope that political circumstances would change before the reserves ran out. That hope in the winter of 1918 and the spring of 1919 still seemed reasonable. It would not seem reasonable for much longer. The children absorbed this atmosphere without understanding its politics. What they knew was that the adults were waiting for something, that the house felt different from the houses they had known before, that there were fewer servants and the food was plainer and the rooms were colder, and that their mother's bearing, upright, disciplined, watchful, almost military in its refusal to bend, contained a tension they could feel even if they could not name it. Otto, 6 years old, was old enough to sense that his name carried a weight the other children's names did not. People looked at him differently. Adults spoke to him with a formality that the other children did not receive. He was already, without understanding it, becoming less a child and more a symbol, the crown prince of a kingdom that existed only in his mother's insistence that it still did. Adelheid, 4, was old enough to absorb mood. She watched the adults. She noticed changes. She was the kind of child who filed observations away and returned to them later, a quality that would serve her well in the decades of adaptation ahead. The younger ones, Robert Felix Karl Ludwig, still an infant, existed in a fog of routine that the governesses maintained with the same deliberate care that a field hospital maintains its schedules. Because structure, when everything else has fallen away, is the last form of protection anyone can offer. The waiting ended on March the 23rd, 1919. The decision had been made, not by Karl and not by Zita, but by the new Austrian Republic and its allied guarantors, that the family must leave the country. The terms were arranged through Colonel Edward Liesel Strutt, a British officer dispatched to oversee the departure with a mix of diplomatic tact and military precision. What happened that day at Eckartsau was the first true severance, the physical cutting of the Habsburg family from the land they had governed since the 13th century. And the scene should be imagined with the plainness it deserves because the plainness is the point. Trunks were loaded onto wagons. Karl had been permitted to take furniture, personal effects, and works of art that were classified as private rather than crown property, and these had been packed with the anxious care of people who understood they were handling the portable remains of a vanished world. The distinction between private and crown property was already contested and would remain so for years. But in the confusion of that March morning, the packing went forward because the alternative was to leave with nothing at all. The children were dressed and gathered, Otto in a coat, Adelheid holding someone's hand. The smaller children carried or led by the governesses and remaining nursery staff. Zita, 26 years old and already carrying the pregnancy that would produce, Rudolf, later that year, walked out of the lodge and into the vehicle that would take them to the railway station at Kopstetten. She did not look back, or if she did, no one recorded it. What was recorded, in accounts that surfaced later, was the composure with which she managed the departure. The children accounted for, the staff organized, the trunks loaded, the appearances maintained even in the act of being expelled. It was the first of many departures she would manage over the decades ahead, and it established the template. Zita did not permit disorder. She did not permit self-pity. She did not permit the children to understand the departure as defeat. It was a journey. It was temporary. They would carry themselves as Habsburgs because that was what they were, and being what they were did not depend on the permission of any republic. Behind her, Schloss Eckartsau would eventually become a heritage site, a place for tourists to walk through rooms where an empire had drawn its last domestic breath. Ahead of her was Switzerland, and after Switzerland, a chain of residences that would grow smaller and more precarious with each link. The train carried them westward through an Austria that was no longer theirs. The landscape outside the windows had not changed. The same fields, the same villages, the same churches whose spires the family had passed 100 times on journeys between residences. But the political meaning of that landscape had been entirely rewritten. The farms no longer belonged to a system of crown lands overseen by the dynasty. The villages no longer owed their churches to imperial patronage. The Austria sliding past the train windows was a republic now, and the family inside the train was leaving it not as travelers, but as people who had been asked to go. At the Swiss border, whatever formal courtesies the old world still owed them ended. They crossed into Switzerland as exiles, not refugees in the modern legal sense, not immigrants with a destination and a plan, but a displaced dynastic household that the Swiss Confederation agreed to receive on the explicit understanding that they would stay away from the Austrian border and refrain from political activity that might destabilize the fragile new order in Central Europe. The first residence was Warteg, a castle near Rorschach on the southern shore of Lake Constance, made available through aristocratic connections that still functioned even when political ones had been severed. The family arrived in spring, the lake glinting in the early season light, the castle's modest towers visible from the road, a building that would have passed for a minor country house in the old Habsburg geography, a place where a minor archduke might have spent a shooting weekend, not a place where an emperor and empress and their children would establish a household. Warteg was comfortable by any reasonable standard. The rooms were adequate, the grounds were pleasant enough for the children to play in, and the governesses could take them walking along the lakeside path while maintaining the fiction of normality that had become their primary professional skill. By Habsburg standards, however, Warteg was a diminishment so stark that it required a constant, invisible effort of will not to acknowledge it aloud. The family that had moved between 2,600 rooms at the Hofburg and 1,400 at Schönbrunn was now living in a borrowed castle with a handful of bedrooms and a staff that could be counted on two hands. The silver was their own, brought from Eckartsau in the railway wagons. The furniture included pieces salvaged from the imperial household. The children's toys had survived the journey, but the institutional machinery that had given all of these objects their context, the court calendar, the state kitchen, the army of servants, the treasury, the government itself, was gone, as thoroughly gone as if it had never existed. What remained was a woman, her husband, her mother-in-law, a few loyal retainers, and a house full of small children who needed to be fed, washed, schooled, dressed, put to bed, comforted when they cried, and raised in a manner consistent with a dynasty that officially no longer functioned. There is a particular cruelty in comfortable exile, and the Swiss years exposed it with a patience that was itself a form of punishment. The family was not starving, they were not imprisoned, they were not in physical danger. The houses they occupied were solid, pleasant, and by any middle-class standard entirely sufficient for a large family. The Swiss countryside was beautiful. The air was clean. The children could play outside. If you described the material conditions of someone who did not know the context, they would not have recognized it as suffering. But the psychological reality was something else entirely, because suffering is not only material, it is the distance between what you are and what you have, and that distance, for the Habsburgs in Switzerland, was immense. They were watched. The Swiss authorities monitored their movements, their visitors, their correspondence. Monarchist supporters arrived periodically, keeping alive the idea that restoration was possible, but their visits also attracted the attention of intelligence services from Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Allied powers, all of whom had an interest in ensuring the Habsburgs stayed where they had been placed. The household still performed its old rituals in miniature. Mass said by a chaplain each morning, the correct forms of address maintained between family members and staff, the children's education structured around languages, Catholic instruction, history, and the dynastic knowledge that was their peculiar inheritance. But the gap between the ritual and the reality widened with each passing month. They were a court without a state, a government without a country, a hierarchy whose internal logic corresponded to nothing in the world outside the villa's gates. And the women felt this gap most acutely, not as an abstract political problem, but as the texture of their daily lives, because they were the ones who had to bridge it every morning, teaching the children to behave as Habsburgs while serving meals in a borrowed dining room, maintaining the carriage of an empress while hanging laundry that no palace staff would come to collect, performing the continuity of a dynasty while knowing that the dynasty's actual power had evaporated and might never return. The Swiss government, uncomfortable with the family's proximity to the Austrian border at Warteg, a proximity that made the Austrian Republic nervous and the Swiss authorities responsible for ensuring that Karl did not attempt a clandestine return, required them to relocate further into the interior of the country. The move itself was another small humiliation wrapped in the language of administrative necessity. They were not being expelled, they were being repositioned. The distinction existed for the benefit of diplomats, not for the family that had to pack its trunks again, explain to the children that this house too was temporary, and reassembled a household in yet another borrowed setting. They moved to Villa Prangens, on the northern shore of Lake Geneva near Nyon, a residence that was more spacious than Warteg, set among vineyards and orchards with views across the lake, toward the Jura mountain, and on clear days, the distant presence of the Alps. Prangens had the advantage of distance from Austria and the complication of distance from the networks of monarchist support that had sustained the family's hope at Warteg. It was, in a quiet way, a more honest place, farther from the fantasy of return, closer to the reality of indefinite exile. Prangens became the family's most stable Swiss home, and it was there that the exile household found its longer-term shape. The routines hardened into something that resembled normalcy if you did not look too closely at what was missing. The children rose early. They attended Mass in a room that had been designated for the purpose, the chaplain performing the liturgy with the same care he would have given it at the Hofburg, the children kneeling in a row that shrank from eldest to youngest. After Mass came lessons, languages, German, French, Italian, Hungarian, the polyglot education that the family's scattered future would require, and history and catechism and the manners and protocols appropriate to their station. The governesses taught the girls needlework and deportment. The tutors taught the boys subjects that assumed they would one day occupy positions of public responsibility. Nobody said aloud that none of these positions currently existed. The education was an act of faith as much as an act of pedagogy, preparing children for a world that might return or might not, and the women who administered it understood both possibilities without being permitted to articulate the second. The ladies-in-waiting and governesses who had followed the family deserved their own recognition in this story, because they were the women who made the women's labor possible. Countess Bellegarde and Therese von Kersenbrock, who had been with the household since before the exile began, became indispensable not merely for practical reasons, but because they carried institutional memory. They remembered how things had been done at court. They maintained the standards that Zita insisted upon. They were the secondary support structure, the women behind the woman, who allowed Zita to sustain the performance of dynastic continuity without collapsing under its physical and emotional weight. They were not paid well. They were not living in condition that their own backgrounds had prepared them for. They stayed because they believed in the family, or because they believed in Zita, or because the culture they shared with the household was the only culture they knew, and leaving it would have meant becoming someone else entirely. Their loyalty was genuine, but it was also a form of captivity, the same captivity that held the entire household in place, the captivity of an identity that could not survive outside the structure that sustained it. Charlotte was born at Prengens on March the 1st, 1921, the seventh child, delivered not in a palace with court physicians and ceremonial announcements, but in a Swiss villa, attended by whatever medical care the family could arrange, welcomed into a world that offered her no throne, no state, and no certainty beyond the fact that her mother would raise her as though all of those things still existed. The birth was both a domestic event and a statement of intent. The family was still producing children. The line was still continuing, and Zita would ensure that every child born into exile carried the same obligations and expectations as the children born in the Hofburg. Charlotte would not know, for years, that the world she was being prepared for no longer existed. She would grow up speaking the right languages, observing the right prayers, absorbing the right historical knowledge, and only gradually, through the accumulation of small recognitions, the kind that come to intelligent children in displaced households, would she begin to understand that the preparation and the reality were diverging. That understanding would eventually lead her not toward bitterness, but toward a life of practical usefulness that no one in the household at Prengens could have predicted. But that was decades away. In 1921, she was a newborn in a villa on Lake Geneva, and the household around her was about to be disrupted again because Karl could not leave the idea of restoration alone. His first attempt came in late March 1921, within weeks of Charlotte's birth, a timing that said everything about the hierarchy of obligations inside the household. The dynasty's political claims took precedence over the domestic reality of a newborn child and a wife who had just given birth. Karl traveled secretly from Switzerland to Hungary, crossing borders on documents that did not bear his real name, moving through a Europe that had rearranged itself around his absence and would not have welcomed his reappearance. He arrived at the episcopal residence of the Bishop of Szombathely in western Hungary, received the support of local monarchists, and then proceeded by car to Budapest to confront the man who held the power he believed was rightfully his. Admiral Miklos Horthy had been appointed regent of the Kingdom of Hungary, a kingdom that still officially existed in constitutional form, with Karl as its absent king, and Karl's plan, such as it was, rested on the assumption that when the sovereign appeared in person, the regent would recognize his claim and step aside. The meeting took place at the royal castle. Horthy did not step aside. He was courteous, even respectful, but he cited the political situation, the implacable opposition of the Allied powers, the danger of provoking the little Entente states, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, that bordered Hungary and feared a Habsburg return above almost anything else. Karl listened, argued, was rebuffed, and after several days of fruitless negotiation returned to Switzerland humiliated, his secret journey to Budapest having accomplished nothing except the confirmation that the regent preferred the comfortable ambiguity of regency to the risk of actual restoration. For the women at Prengens, the first attempt meant weeks of secrecy and anxiety, the particular strain of maintaining a household and caring for a newborn, while the head of the family was engaged in an enterprise that could result in his imprisonment, his exile to somewhere far worse than Switzerland, or his death. The second attempt, 6 months later in October 1921, was more dramatic, more coordinated, and more reckless. This time, Zita went with him. The couple flew from Switzerland to the town of Sopron in western Hungary, where loyalist military units had pledged their support, and from there they began a march toward Budapest at the head of a small force that grew as it moved eastward. For a few extraordinary days, restoration appeared genuinely possible. The loyalist column advanced. Towns declared for Karl. The old symbols reappeared: Habsburg flags, cheering crowds, the emotional release of a population that had never fully accepted the dynasty's removal. And then it collapsed. Horthy's government rallied its own forces. The Allies issued ultimatums. Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia mobilized troops on Hungary's borders, threatening invasion if the restoration proceeded. The march stalled. The loyalist forces were disarmed, and Karl and Zita found themselves not restored but arrested, held under guard while the great powers decided what to do with them. The adventure that had begun with flags and cheering ended in a room under military watch, and the couple who had gambled their family's remaining political credibility on one final attempt to recover a crown discovered that the gamble had cost them not only the crown, but their freedom of movement across an entire continent. For the women left behind at Prangons, the governesses maintaining their routines with white-knuckle discipline, the older children sensing the disruption even through the household's careful silence, Maria Josefa in her chapel praying with the quiet ferocity of a woman who had entrusted her son's fate to God and now had to wait for God's answer. The second Hungarian attempt was a different kind of devastation from the first. The first had been a shock, a break in the expected pattern of quiet exile. The second was itself a pattern, and patterns once recognized change the emotional landscape of a household in ways that cannot be undone. The children understood, or began to understand, that their father's departures were not ordinary absences, that each time he left there was a chance he would not come back, or would come back diminished, defeated, carrying a failure that the household would have to absorb into its already strained architecture of dignity. Otto, now 9, was old enough to feel the weight of what his father was attempting on his behalf. Adelheid, 7, was old enough to see her mother's composure and to begin wondering what it cost. The governesses understood that the household they maintained with such discipline existed inside a volatility they could neither predict nor control, and that their own futures, their livelihoods, their identities, the meaning of their daily work depended on the outcome of political adventures planned in rooms to which they had no access. And the practical consequences of the second attempt were immediate and severe. The Allied powers decided that Karl and Zita must be removed not merely from Hungary but from Europe altogether. The Conference of Ambassadors demanded exile to a location sufficiently remote to prevent any further attempts at restoration. The destination chosen was Madeira, a Portuguese island in the Atlantic Ocean, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest European capital, far enough from any throne to satisfy even the most anxious diplomat. On November the 1st, 1921, Karl and Zita were placed aboard HMS Cardiff, a British light cruiser, and taken from the Danube port at Baja down the river to the Black Sea, through the Bosporus, across the Mediterranean, and out into the Atlantic. The voyage took days. The warship was not a passenger vessel, and the conditions, while not harsh, were a long way from the comfort the family had known even in exile. Zita, who had accompanied Karl on the second restoration attempt with the same conviction with which she had supported the first, now found herself carried across the seas of Europe as effectively a prisoner of the Allied powers. Not imprisoned in a cell, not mistreated in any visible way, but placed aboard a military vessel whose destination she had not chosen and whose course she could not alter. The children followed separately, escorted by members of the household staff, their passage arranged through the same diplomatic machinery that had decided their parents' fate. The family was not going to Madeira because they had chosen it. They were not going because it offered any advantage, any possibility, any future. They were going because Europe had decided they were a difficulty best managed by distance, and the governments of the continent had weighed the question of what to do with the Habsburgs and had arrived at an answer that was not punishment exactly, but something more insidious and more final. They had been made irrelevant by geography. There is something about the passage, the warship, the forced route through the Mediterranean, the Atlantic destination, that marks a threshold in the story. Before the Hungarian attempts, the exile had been uncomfortable, but theoretically reversible. The family had lived in Switzerland under restrictions, but with the residual possibility that events might shift in their favor, that a change of government or a diplomatic realignment might open the path back to Budapest or even to Vienna. After the Hungarian attempts, that possibility was extinguished. The family had gambled twice and lost twice, and the losing had consequences that would reshape every dimension of the women's lives for years to come. They were no longer exiles in the genteel European sense, titled people living quietly abroad while political currents shifted. They were a household that had been picked up bodily and deposited on an island in the Atlantic because the governments of Europe had concluded that the safest thing to do with this particular family was to put an ocean between them and the nearest crown. The shrinking rooms had contracted again, and the next contraction, the one that would change everything, that would convert Zita from wife to widow and the family from a dynastic household to something more precarious and more permanent, was already approaching, carried on the damp Madeiran air and the failing health of a man who was 34 years old and who had already lived more history than most people encounter in a lifetime. Madeira rose out of the Atlantic like a fist of volcanic rock softened by vegetation and cloud. The island sat more than 500 miles from the coast of Morocco and nearly 1,000 from Lisbon, its nearest European capital in any practical sense, and its remoteness was precisely the point. The family arrived in late November 1921, carried to the harbor at Funchal, aboard the vessel that had brought them from the Mediterranean, and their first sight of the place that would become the most consequential address of their exile was the waterfront of a small Atlantic city built on steep slopes above a harbor, where fishing boats outnumbered warships and the air carried the smell of salt and subtropical growth. After Switzerland, the orderly lakeside villas, the alpine clarity, the polite surveillance of a neutral state, Madeira was something else. Warmer, damper, more isolated, and possessed of a beauty that had nothing to do with this central European world the family had lost. The mountains behind Funchal climbed sharply into cloud. The gardens were lush with species the children had never seen. The light was different, everything was different, and the family, stepping onto the quay with whatever composure they could maintain, understood that they had arrived not at a destination, but at a sentence. The first accommodation was Reed's Palace Hotel, perched on its cliff top above the sea with the assured grandeur of a Victorian institution, designed to make wealthy British and European travelers feel that civilization had followed them to the edge of the Atlantic. Reed's had been welcoming guests of means since the 1890s. Its gardens were immaculate. Its dining rooms were paneled and lit with the warm confidence of a place that understood how to make money feel at home. For a few weeks after the family's arrival, the hotel sustained a kind of illusion, the illusion that exile could still be managed within the conventions of the old world, that a displaced empress and her children could live in a manner consistent with their former station, if not their current means. The hotel staff treated them with deference that came naturally in an establishment accustomed to titled guests. The correct forms of address were used. Meals were served on china with the unhurried formality that Reed's extended to all its residents. The rooms were spacious, the beds were clean, the views of the Atlantic from the terrace were genuinely beautiful. And the children, who had now lived in so many temporary places that the concept of home had become almost theoretical, adapted to the hotel's corridors and gardens with the resilience that children bring to environments that adults find disorienting. For a few weeks, if you did not ask about the bill, if you did not inquire how long this arrangement could possibly continue, the surface appeared almost normal. But normality cost money, and the money was running out. But the bill existed, and it could not be ignored. The cost of maintaining a family of Carl and Zita's size at Reed's Palace exceeded what the household could sustain. The financial reality that had been tightening since the departure from Austria now reached the point where it could no longer be managed through dignity alone. The family's liquid resources were desperately limited. Carl had brought railway wagons of furniture and artworks out of Austria, but furniture and art do not pay hotel bills. A proposed annual payment from the Austrian state had been discussed in the negotiations surrounding the exile, but had never been formalized, never implemented, never arrived. The crown jewels, those pieces whose ownership was not contested by the Republic, existed in a legal and practical limbo that made them difficult to convert into income. Some jewelry would be pawned or sold in the years ahead, but the process was slow, undignified, and yielded far less than the object's ceremonial significance might have suggested. The family that had once inhabited state palaces funded by the machinery of a 50 million person empire now could not afford a hotel room on a Portuguese island in the Atlantic. That is the kind of detail that turns dynastic history into family drama, because it is not abstract. It is a woman lying awake at night, calculating whether the money will last the month, and knowing that it will not, and knowing that her children must not see that knowledge on her face in the morning. The move from Reed's to Quinta do Monte was the next contraction in the sequence of shrinking rooms that had begun at Schönbrunn and passed through the Hofburg, Eckartsau, Warteg, Prangins, and now this. Quinta do Monte was a villa in the hills above Funchal, situated in the parish of Monte at an altitude of roughly 550 meters, where the climate was cooler and considerably damper than the coast below. The house had been offered to the family through local connections and the network of Catholic charitable goodwill that still functioned even when political support had evaporated, a residence that was adequate for a large household, but that bore no resemblance to anything the family had known before. Not to the imperial palaces with their hundreds of rooms and thousands of staff, not to the Swiss villas with their lakeside views and orderly gardens, not even to Reed's with its professional service and cliff-top terraces. The rooms at Quinta do Monte were modest in proportion and modest in furnishing. The gardens were pleasant but unremarkable. The altitude, which might have been bracing in a different climate, produced on Madeira a persistent damp that seeped through the walls, settled into clothing, and hung in the air of rooms where fires could not always be lit because fuel was an expense, and expenses had to be calculated with a precision that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who had known the old household. The villa was not uncomfortable in the way that a prison is uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable in the way that a life lived below one's own self-understanding is uncomfortable. Constantly, invisibly, and in a register that no one outside the household would have recognized as suffering. It was a house, not a palace, and the family inhabited it as a house. But inside its walls, they continued to behave as though the structure they carried in their minds, the court, the dynasty, the covenant with God, still held. This is where the documentary's central irony comes most sharply into focus, and the outline should let it cut. The men of the Habsburg family, Karl as emperor in exile, Otto as heir in waiting, remained the figures most legible to the outside world. They were the names in the diplomatic correspondence, the subjects of newspaper speculation, the targets of political surveillance. When foreign governments worried about the Habsburgs, they worried about Karl and Otto. When monarchist supporters sent funds or encouragement, they sent them in the name of the dynasty's male line. The political symbolism of the family attached to its men as it had always done, and that symbolism consumed most of the attention that the world was willing to pay to a fallen imperial house on an Atlantic island. But the real work of keeping the family alive, and not symbolically alive, not dynastically alive, but physically, emotionally, practically alive, was done by the women. Zita managed the household. She decided what could be afforded and what could not. She oversaw the children's education, their religious formation, their health, their emotional well-being. She negotiated with creditors and benefactors and the representatives of governments that wished the family would simply disappear. She maintained the daily schedule that gave the household its structure: mass in the morning, lessons for the children, meals served with whatever formality the reduced staff could sustain, prayers in the evening, and throughout it all the unspoken insistence that standards were not a luxury, but the family's last line of defense against dissolution. Maria Josefa, Karl's mother, prayed and bore witness and maintained her own composure with the granite endurance of a woman who had decided that God's will was inscrutable and her duty was obedience. The governesses kept the children's routines intact. The remaining ladies in waiting performed functions that had shrunk from ceremonial to practical. They were not dressing an empress for state occasions, but helping a mother manage a household of small children in a damp villa on a mountain. And none of them complained, or if they complained, they did it in private, because the household's code did not permit the acknowledgement of diminishment. Diminishment was simply the current form of the trial, and trials, in the family's theology, were to be endured. The finances deserve a fuller accounting because they are the mechanism through which the abstract fact of dynastic collapse became the daily texture of the women's lives. The old Habsburg wealth had not evaporated in a single catastrophe, the way a fortune lost in a stock market crash disappears overnight. It had been dismantled piece by piece through a combination of state confiscation, legal contestation, geographic inaccessibility, and the slow erosion that comes from spending without income. The Habsburg Law of 1919 had transferred crown-related properties to the Austrian state. The private assets that remained, art, furniture, jewelry, personal property, were scattered across jurisdictions, difficult to sell from exile, and in many cases subject to competing claims. Karl had managed to bring some portable wealth out of Austria, but portable wealth has a way of becoming less portable with each border crossed and each year passed. On Madeira, the family depended on a combination of what they had brought, what could be quietly sold or pawned, and the charity of supporters, royalist sympathizers, aristocratic networks, Catholic organizations, whose generosity was real but unreliable. The women lived inside this financial precariousness every day. They stretched meals, they calculated costs, they made decisions about what the children could have and what they could not. Decisions that in the old world would have been inconceivable and in the new world were as routine as morning prayer. There is something about the coexistence of former grandeur and present poverty that produces a particular kind of emotional strain, and Quinta do Monte was saturated with it. The family still possessed objects that testified to their former station: silver bearing the imperial monogram, books from the court library, clothing that had been made for a different life. These objects sat inside the modest rooms of a Madeiran villa like fragments of a language that no one around them spoke any longer. The children played with toys that had been packed at Eckartsau. They ate meals served on plates that had once been part of a household numbering hundreds of staff. They knelt for prayers led by a chaplain who had once served at the imperial court and now served in a room that doubled as a chapel because there was no other space. The contrast was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It was domestic, daily, and relentless. It was the sound of a silver spoon against a plate in a house that could not afford to heat all its rooms. It was the sight of an empress's gown hanging in a wardrobe in a villa where the walls wept with damp. The women lived with this contrast not as an occasional reminder of what they had lost, but as the permanent condition of their existence, and they were not permitted, by the family's code, by their own training, by the expectations they placed on themselves, and to say that it hurt. At Quinta do Monte, the family's individual trajectories began to separate in ways that would define the rest of the story. The separation was not visible to outsiders, who would have seen only a displaced imperial household living in reduced circumstances on a beautiful island. But inside the villa, each member of the family was beginning to inhabit the exile differently, and those differences mattered because they would determine what kind of people emerged from the other side of the catastrophe that was coming. Otto, 9 years old in the winter of 1921, was the child whose fate was most constrained by the family's mythology. He was the eldest son, the heir, the crown prince of a monarchy that existed now only in his mother's insistence and the legal fictions of Hungarian constitutional law. Everything about his upbringing was shaped by this symbolic role. His education was more rigorous than his siblings. His behavior was more closely watched. The way adults spoke to him carried a weight, a formality, an expectation, a projection of future authority that the other children did not receive. He was being raised not merely as a boy, but as a future sovereign. And the fact that no sovereignty existed for him to inherit did not diminish the intensity of the preparation. If anything, it increased it, because the preparation was the family's way of insisting that the inheritance was real. For Otto, the cost of this insistence would unfold across decades. He would eventually become not a restored emperor, but a European politician, a man who transformed the energy of dynastic obligation into the different grammar of post-war democratic engagement. But on Madeira, he was a child, and the burden he carried was not his to choose. Adelheid, 7, was the daughter whose intellectual seriousness was already visible to those who watched her closely. She observed, she listened. She absorbed the atmosphere of the household with a precision that the younger children could not yet manage, and she carried her observations forward into a quiet, intense interior life that the family's culture of emotional discipline encouraged but did not ask about. She was being educated according to the same dynastic program as her siblings, but something in her temperament was already pulling in a different direction, toward analysis, toward understanding, toward the kind of systematic thinking about social structures that would later take her to Fordham and a career in sociology. The exile was forming her not into a princess waiting for restoration, but into an intellectual formed by displacement. She would not recognize that formation for years. On Madeira, she was a child kneeling at mass beside her siblings, doing her lessons, watching her mother's face for signals about whether the day would be ordinary or extraordinary in ways the adults would not explain. Charlotte was not yet a year old when the family arrived on Madeira, and her experience of the island was purely sensory. Warmth, humidity, the sounds of a household in motion around her, the faces of the women who fed and held and dressed her. She would have no conscious memory of Quinta do Monte, but she was being shaped by it nonetheless, because the household she was born into was the household she would carry as her emotional template for the rest of her life. The discipline, the prayer, the insistence on standards, the formality between adults and children, the unspoken rule that feelings were to be managed rather than expressed, all of this was entering her nervous system in the way that early environments always do, below the level of conscious memory, but above the level of irrelevance. Charlotte would grow into the most practically oriented of the daughters, the one who would study economics, work in social welfare, and live under an assumed name in one of New York's most deprived neighborhoods. The seeds of that practical orientation were being planted at Quinta do Monte in a household where the gap between the family's self image and its actual circumstances was so vast that only the most disciplined practicality could bridge it. The younger children, Robert Felix, Karl Ludwig, Rudolf, formed a second tier in the household's internal architecture. They were too young to understand what had happened, too young to carry the symbolic weight that Otto bore or the observational intensity that Adelheid displayed. They were simply children in a house on a hill above Funchal, playing in rooms that were smaller than the rooms they had been born in, cared for by women whose titles no longer corresponded to any court function, but whose devotion to the family had survived every reduction. Robert, 6 years old, in the winter of 1921, was already developing the quiet, serious temperament that would later characterize his adult life. Felix, 5, was more animated, more physically restless, harder to contain within the household's disciplined routines. Karl Ludwig and Rudolf, 3 and 2 respectively, existed in the world of very small children, where the politics of exile are invisible and the quality of life is measured in warmth, food, attention, and the proximity of familiar faces. The governesses managed all of them with a professional care that had not diminished since the days when they had managed nurseries in imperial residences. The same standards, the same expectations, the same gentle firmness applied now in a villa where the plaster was damp and the heating was unreliable. The boys would later grow into men who carried their Habsburg identity in markedly different ways, some embracing it publicly, some retreating into quieter lives. But on Madeira, they were part of the household's collective weight, the massive young life that Zita had to feed, educate, clothe, doctor when they fell ill, comfort when they cried, and hold together with a discipline that drew on every resource her own Bourbon Parma upbringing had given her. 8 children, a borrowed house, a diminishing treasury, a husband whose health was changing, and a code that said none of this could be spoken about as though it were anything other than temporary. And Zita herself was pregnant again. The child she was carrying, the eighth, the one who would be born after Karl's death and named Elizabeth, was both a continuation of the family's biological momentum and an extraordinary burden on a woman who was already managing more than most human beings could be asked to endure. She was 29 years old. She was living in a damp villa on an Atlantic island that she had not chosen and could not afford. She had 7 children under the age of 10, each of whom needed her attention, her discipline, her warmth, and her capacity to make the present feel safe, even when the future offered no safety at all. Her husband was politically defeated, financially constrained, watched by governments that considered him a nuisance, and increasingly unwell in ways that she could see even if she did not yet permit herself to articulate what they meant. Thus, the proposed financial settlement from Austria had never materialized and showed no sign of doing so. The household's reserves were dwindling toward a point where the question would no longer be what standard of life could be maintained, but whether the household could be maintained at all. The future held nothing certain except the continuation of exile, and even that certainty carried the uncertainty of where the exile might lead next. Because Madeira was not a permanent arrangement, it was a solution imposed by the Allied powers, and solutions imposed by powers have a way of being revised when the powers find a new solution more convenient. Zita carried the pregnancy with the same composure she carried everything else, publicly disciplined, privately strained to a degree that no one in the household was permitted to measure, and sustained by a faith that told her endurance was not merely a practical necessity, but a spiritual obligation owed to God, to the dynasty, and to the children who would inherit whatever she managed to preserve. She did not, by any surviving account, allow the household to see her falter. The composure was not performance in the theatrical sense, it was conviction. She believed that what she was doing mattered, that the family's continuity was worth the cost of maintaining it, and that the cost, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the financial terror, the damp rooms, the diminishing staff, the children's confusion, was the form that fidelity took when everything else had been stripped away. That conviction would sustain her for the next 67 years. But it would be tested within weeks, more severely than she or anyone around her could have imagined. But Karl was faltering. Not politically. That battle had been lost at Budapest and sealed aboard HMS Cardiff. Physically. The accumulated strain of everything that had happened since 1916, the impossible wartime inheritance, the Sixtus affair, the humiliation of the renunciation, the exile across 3 countries, the 2 failed restoration attempts, the forced voyage to an Atlantic island, and the constant grinding pressure of being a man who believed himself to be an emperor, but who was treated by the world as a problem to be stored somewhere out of the way. All of it was written on his body. Karl had never been robustly healthy in the way that some men of his line were. He was slender, not physically imposing, and the years since his accession had taken a toll that his youth could no longer absorb. The photographs from the early years of his marriage show a young man with an open face and a posture that suggests confidence without arrogance. The photographs from Madeira, where any exists, show something else. A man whose face is narrowed, whose eyes carry a tiredness that rest does not remove, whose bearing is shifted from that of a sovereign enduring difficulty to that of a person who has been worn down by it. On Madeira, in the damp air of the mountain villa where the altitude pressed on the lungs and the moisture crept through the walls, Karl's resistance was lowering in ways that the household could feel even when they could not yet diagnose. He caught colds that lingered for weeks. He tired more easily than a man of 34 should have done. The energy that had driven the Hungarian adventures, the restless, conviction-fueled determination to act, to move, to recover what had been lost, was not replenished by the island's enforced stillness. Stillness for Karl was not rest. It was the absence of the only activity that had given his exile meaning. He was, although nobody around him would have used the word yet, declining. The household noticed because households always notice. The governesses saw the emperor coughing in the mornings and exchanged glances that they did not let the children intercept. The chaplain saw Karl at Mass, looking drawn, his attention sometimes wandering from the liturgy in a way it had not done before, and he prayed with particular intensity for the health of a man he had followed into exile out of devotion. Maria Josefa, who had watched her son through the catastrophe of the war and the humiliations of exile with the silent, enduring stoicism of a woman whose faith was her only remaining weapon, saw something in Karl's face during that first Madeiran winter that she had learned not to name aloud, because naming it would give it power, and the family's code required that power be withheld from fear until fear became unavoidable fact. The remaining servants noticed, the children noticed, in the way that children notice a change in the rhythm of a household, even when no one tells them what has changed. The way a father who used to play with them now sits more often in his chair. The way a mother's face tightens when she looks at her husband across the room and thinks no one is watching. Zita saw it too. She was too intelligent, too observant, too closely bound to Karl by the genuine affection that had characterized their marriage from the beginning, not to see that his health was changing in a direction that carried implications she could not afford to contemplate, but acknowledging that change fully, allowing it the weight it deserved in her calculations, would have meant acknowledging a possibility so devastating that it threatened the entire structure of the household's survival. A structure she had built and was still building, brick by careful brick, out of discipline and faith in the refusal to admit that the dynasty's story might end not with restoration, but with a death in a borrowed house. If Karl died, the dynasty's claim passed to Otto, a child of 9. If Karl died, the financial situation became not merely strained, but potentially unmanageable. If Karl died, Zita became not merely the mother of 8, but the sole adult authority in a displaced household with no state, no reliable income, no diplomatic protector, and no guarantee that the governments which had exiled them would feel any obligation to the widow they had created. Every calculation she had been making since November 1918 would have to be remade from nothing, and the raw material from which she would have to remake it, her faith, her discipline, her stubbornness, her love for her children, was the same material she was already spending at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. She would not let herself think that way, not yet, not fully. The family's code, the one that had sustained them through every reduction and every humiliation and every border crossed with children in tow, demanded that the present be managed with discipline and the future be entrusted to God. And so the household continued its rhythm at Quinta do Monte, as though rhythm itself were a form of prayer. Mass was said each morning in the room that served as chapel. Lessons were taught, the children were drilled in their languages and their catechism. Meals were served with whatever formality the diminished staff could sustain, on silver that still bore the imperial monogram, even though no empire existed to give that monogram its authority. The damp crept through the walls. The Atlantic wind moved through the gardens and rattled the shutters at night. The clouds that gathered around the mountain above Funchal descended in the evenings and wrapped the villa in a moisture that settled on everything, on the furniture, on the bedclothes, on Karl's chest. And in the early months of 1922, what had been a slow decline became something sharper and more frightening. Karl's colds deepened into something that did not lift. The coughing became persistent, wet, exhausting. The fatigue that had been accumulating for months settled over him like a weight that sleep could not remove. The doctors who attended him on the island, their options limited by Madeira's remoteness and the household's limited resources, spoke of influenza, of bronchitis, of pneumonia, of the complications that arise when a weakened body encounters an infection it cannot fight. They spoke carefully, because speaking carefully was what doctors did when the patient was an emperor, even a deposed one. But the careful words carried a meaning that Zita could read as plainly as if they had been shouted. The family that had lost its empire, its country, its property, its income, its political future, and its place on the map of Europe, was now facing the possibility of losing the person around whom all of those losses had been organized. The man whose claim had justified every sacrifice, whose name had sustained every ritual, whose presence in the household had given it a reason to exist beyond the mere fact of survival. Karl was 34 years old. He had been emperor for 2 years and exile for 4. And the illness that was settling into his lungs in the damp mountain air of Quinta do Monte was not going to lift. The illness did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a series of worsening days that blurred into one another, each one taking something from Karl that the next did not return. Through March 1922, the pattern established itself with the quiet cruelty of a body that has decided to surrender. Karl would improve slightly. The fever would ease for a day, the coughing would subside enough for him to sit up in bed and speak to Zita about the children's lessons or about news from the monarchist networks that still maintained sporadic contact. And the household would allow itself a cautious breath, a fragile recalibration of hope. And then the improvement would reverse. The coughing would return, deeper and wetter than before, producing the sounds that Zita could hear through the walls of the villa when she was in other rooms attending to the children or conferring with the household staff. The fever would climb again, flushing Karl's thin face and producing the restless, uncomfortable sleep of a body fighting an enemy it was losing to. And the doctors would arrive at the bedside and perform their examinations and speak in the careful, hedging language that doctors use when they are watching something they cannot stop but are not yet prepared to say so aloud. The diagnosis that emerged was influenza complicated by bronchitis, progressing toward pneumonia, a cascade of respiratory failure that in a hospital in Vienna, attended by specialists with access to the best care available, might have been survivable. On a remote Atlantic island, in a villa at altitude, in a household with limited medical resources and no possibility of rapid evacuation, the diagnosis carried the weight of a sentence being read aloud in a quiet room where everyone already knew what it said. Zita managed the sick room the way she managed everything else, with discipline, with attention to detail, and with a composure that concealed the scale of what she was confronting. She was at Karl's bedside constantly. She monitored his temperature, his breathing, his lucidity. She consulted with the doctors and translated their careful assessments into decisions about care. She did this while pregnant, while managing 7 other children, while maintaining the household's routines, and while calculating, in the part of her mind that never stopped calculating, what would happen if the worst came. The children were kept close enough to the sick room to feel its gravity, but shielded from its worst moments by the governesses, who understood without being told that their job had shifted from education to emotional protection. Otto, 9 years old, was old enough to understand that his father was seriously ill. Adelheid, 8, was old enough to read the adults' faces. The younger children felt the change in the household's atmosphere. The lowered voices, the closed doors, the way their mother appeared and disappeared with a frequency and an urgency that had not been there before, without being able to name what it meant. Maria Josefa retreated further into prayer. She had been the household's most constant presence of stoic faith since the exile began. The woman who endured every reduction without complaint, because her theology told her that complaint was a failure of trust in God's plan. Now, with her son's health failing, that theology was being tested in its most intimate form. She prayed in the room that served as chapel. She prayed in her own quarters. She prayed with the rosary that had been her companion through the war, through the Renunciation, through Switzerland, through Hungary, through the warship and the Atlantic crossing. The prayers were not petitions for miracle. Or if they were wrapped in the language of submission to divine will that the family's faith required. She was asking God not to save her son exactly, but to do what he would do and to give her the strength to accept it. The distinction sounds academic. In a cold room on a damp mountainside, with the sun coughing through the walls, it was the difference between hope and endurance. The household staff, reduced now to the handful who had followed the family through every stage of the exile, moved through their duties with a heightened awareness that the thing they were maintaining was approaching a crisis that their service could not prevent. The chaplain said Mass with particular solemnity. The governesses kept the children to their routines with a firmness that was itself a form of kindness, because routine was the one thing the children could rely on when everything else was uncertain. The cook prepared whatever meals the household's budget permitted. The servants who remained, those who had chosen years ago to follow an emperor into exile and who now found themselves tending to a dying man in a borrowed house, performed their functions with the quiet, dignified resolve of people who understood that loyalty, having been given, could not now be withdrawn simply because the situation had become unbearable. The gathering storm of Karl's final days should be understood not through dramatic incident, but through the accumulation of mundane details that made the tragedy, when it arrived, feel not like a climax, but like the last step in a descent that had been underway for years. The villa at Quinta do Monte was not equipped for serious illness. The rooms were adequate for daily life, but not for the kind of round-the-clock nursing care that a patient with advanced pneumonia required. The damp that had been an irritation throughout the family's time on the mountain now became a medical danger, the moisture in the air aggravating lungs that were already fighting infection. The doctors did what they could with what they had. They prescribed rest. They managed the fever. They watched the breathing with the focused, helpless attention of professionals who understood that the trajectory was moving in one direction and that their tools were not sufficient to reverse it. Karl, through those final days, was not always fully conscious. The fever produced periods of delirium interspersed with intervals of clarity during which, by later accounts, he spoke to Zita about the children, about their future, about the dynasty's continuation. The content of those conversations belongs to the family's private memory and should be treated with the care that privacy deserves. What can be said, because it was later reported by those who were present, is that Karl's final days were spent in a state of oscillation between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond it, and that Zita was beside him through as much of that oscillation as her body and her other obligations would allow. She sat with him. She held his hand. She prayed. And she watched with the terrible alertness of a woman who understood exactly what was happening. As the man she had married at Schwarzau 11 years earlier, the man who had been emperor for 2 years and exile for 4, the man who had given her 8 children in a life that had moved from palace to hunting lodge to borrowed villa to Atlantic Island, moved closer to the end that no amount of discipline or faith or dynastic conviction could prevent. The last day came on April the 1st, 1922. It was a Saturday. The spring weather on Madeira would have been mild at the coast, but cooler and cloudier at the altitude of Monte, where the villa sat among its gardens and the mountain rose above into mist. The morning brought no improvement. Karl's breathing had become labored in a way that the household recognized, even without medical training, as the sound of a body approaching its limit. Shallow, effortful, interspersed with the wet, rattling coughs that had been worsening for weeks. The fever had not broken. His periods of lucidity were growing shorter, separated by longer intervals of confusion in which he spoke to people who were not in the room, or lay still with his eyes half open, neither awake nor asleep, suspended in the territory between consciousness and its absence. Inside the house, the household had contracted to its smallest and most essential form, the way households do when death is near and the ordinary business of living becomes both necessary and absurd. The children still needed to be fed. The younger ones still needed to be dressed and supervised, but the household's center of gravity had shifted entirely to the sick room, where Zita maintained her vigil with a constancy that had not wavered since the crisis began. She was at Karl's bedside. The chaplain was present, prepared to administer the last rites of the Catholic Church, the sacrament of the anointing of the sick, the prayers for the dying, the ritual structure that the family's faith provided for the moment that secular medicine could no longer address. The children were nearby. Otto and Adelheid, old enough to be aware that something final was approaching, the younger ones held and managed by the governesses in rooms close enough to be cold, but shielded from the immediate reality of a father in the last hours of his life. Maria Josefa was praying, as she had been praying for weeks, with the intensity of a woman whose entire relationship with God was being concentrated into a single petition that she already knew might not be answered in the way she hoped. The doctors were present, their role now less medical than ceremonial. They could observe, they could record, they could confirm what was happening, but they could no longer change its course. Karl received the last sacraments. The chaplain performed the rites. Zita held his hand. The room, a bedroom in a borrowed villa on a mountainside in the Atlantic, became, for the duration of those final hours, the last throne room of the Habsburg dynasty, a place where the forms of Catholic sovereignty were observed one final time over the body of a man who had been emperor and who was now simply dying. The contrast was unbearable precisely because it was not dramatic. There was no state ceremony. There were no ranks of courtiers. There were no guards, no dignitaries, no representatives of the governments and armies and institutions that had once answered to the Habsburg name. There was a wife. There were children in the next room. There was a chaplain. There were servants who had followed their master to the end of the world and now had to watch him leave it. Karl died at Quinta do Monte on the afternoon of April the 1st, 1922. He was 34 years old. Zita was 29 and pregnant with their 8th child. The cause of death was recorded as bronchopneumonia, a clinical term that described the mechanics of what had happened to his lungs, but said nothing about the years of strain, displacement, political defeat, forced movement, and accumulated exhaustion that had worn down the body in which those lungs had to function. He died in a borrowed house on an island in the Atlantic Ocean, more than 1,000 miles from the capital of the empire he had briefly ruled, in a room that was not a state chamber, but a bedroom in a villa whose rent the family could barely afford. The dynasty that had buried its emperors in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna, in the heart of the imperial capital, surrounded by the elaborate ceremonial architecture of 6 centuries of sovereign death, the double eagle on every coffin, the ritual knocking at the crypt door, the formal recitation of the emperor's titles before the final admission that he was, in death, merely a mortal sinner, was burying this one on a Portuguese island, attended not by the court and the government and the diplomatic corps, but by a widow, a handful of children, a few loyal servants, and a chaplain who had followed his emperor into exile and now had to help the family bury him. There is something about the physical details of that day that the script must let stand without embellishment, because the facts are more devastating than any prose could make them. The room, the bed, the damp, the sound, a man struggling to breathe and then not breathing, and then the silence that follows the last breath, a silence that is different from every other silence, because it is the silence of something that has stopped and will not start again. Zita was there. She had held Karl's hand through the final hours. She had prayed with him and for him. She had been to the end, the woman she had been since the day she married him, present, disciplined, devoted, and refusing to let the scale of what was happening break the composure that her family's code demanded. When Karl stopped breathing, she did not collapse. She did not scream. She closed his eyes and she prayed, and then she began the work of managing what came next, because there was always something next, and the woman who managed it was always her. The children were told. The manner in which each of them received the news varied with their age and capacity to understand. Otto, 9 years old, understood that his father was dead, and that the weight of the dynasty's claim had shifted onto his own shoulders, a burden that no 9-year-old should carry, but that the family's culture had been preparing him for since the day the exile began. By later accounts, he bore the news with a composure that mirrored his mother's, the kind of composure that in a child is not strength, but the learned suppression of an emotion that has nowhere safe to go. Adelheid, 8, understood death in the way that an intelligent child of 8 understands it. Fully enough to feel the loss, not fully enough to comprehend its permanent implications. The younger children understood less and felt more. The disruption of routine, the changed faces of the adults, the absence of a father who had been there and then was not, the sound of their mother's voice carrying a note they had not heard before. The household absorbed the deaths the way it absorbed everything, with discipline, with prayer, and with the immediate practical requirement to do what needed to be done. What needed to be done was a funeral. The arrangements fell to Zita because everything fell to Zita now. The body had to be prepared. The local authorities had to be notified. The church had to be contacted. The diplomatic representatives of the governments that had sent the family to Madeira had to be informed that the man they had exiled was dead. The family's monarchist supporters had to be told. And all of this had to happen while the household continued to function, while the children continued to need care, while the remaining staff continued to require direction, and while Zita herself continued to carry the pregnancy that would produce Elizabeth in less than 2 months. The funeral took place on April the 5th, 1922, 4 days after Karl's death. The procession left Quinta do Monte and descended the mountain road toward the church of Nossa Senhora do Monte, the Church of Our Lady of the Mount, which sat in the center of the Monte parish above Funchal. The distance was not great, a matter of perhaps a kilometer, but the road was steep and winding, dropping through the subtropical vegetation of the hillside, past gardens and low walls, and the modest houses of a community that had watched the imperial family arrive months earlier, with a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and the particular respect the Catholic communities in Southern Europe extended to suffering that was borne with dignity. In the Old World, the funeral of a Habsburg emperor would have been one of the great ceremonial events of the European calendar. The streets of Vienna would have been lined with soldiers. The diplomatic corps would have attended in full dress. The coffin would have been carried through the Innere Stadt to the Kapuzinerkirche, where the ritual of admission to the crypt, the famous knocking on the door, the declaration of titles, the final stripping away of rank before the dead man was admitted as a mere sinner, would have been performed before a congregation that included kings and cardinals and the assembled weight of European sovereignty. On Madeira, the funeral was humbler than anything the dynasty had known in 6 centuries of burying its dead. The coffin was carried by bearers through the mountain road. There were no soldiers. There were no ambassadors. There was no formal delegation from any government. There were the people of Monte, who came out of their houses and stood along the road and crossed themselves as the coffin passed. Zita walked behind the coffin in black, the color she would wear for the remaining 67 years of her life, never again appearing in public in any other shade, a visible, daily, permanent statement of mourning that was also a declaration of identity. She was no longer the wife of the last emperor. She was his widow, and the black was the uniform of a role she would inhabit until her own death in 1989. Her bearing that day, by the accounts of those who were present, was exactly what anyone who knew her would have expected: upright, controlled, devastated, but refusing to let the devastation show on her face in a way that the children or the public could misread as defeat. This was not coldness. It was the Bourbon Parma discipline that her mother had taught her, the Habsburg code that her marriage had reinforced, and the personal conviction that grief owed its first duty to composure and its second to God. She would grieve Karl for the rest of her life, but she would grieve him in private, in prayer, and in the black silk that became as much a part of her as the name she carried. Otto walked with her, a boy of 9, in formal mourning beside a coffin that contained the father whose symbolic legacy he was now expected to carry. The household staff followed. The chaplain led the prayers. And the coffin was carried into the church of Nossa Senhora do Monte, and Karl was buried there, not in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna, not in any of the great churches of the empire, but in a parish church on an Atlantic island, in a grave that would remain there permanently, because the Austrian Republic had no interest in repatriating the body of a man whose dynasty it had abolished, and the family had no power to insist. The burial was the final physical confirmation of what the political world had been declaring since November 1918. The Habsburg Empire was finished, and its last emperor would rest not at the center of his former domain, but at its most distant margin, in a church whose name most of his former subjects would never learn. The days immediately following the burial were the days in which the household's transformation became visible, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a slow, quiet reorganization of everything the family had been. Karl's death did not merely remove a husband and father from a household that depended on him. It removed the figure around whom the entire architecture of the exile had been organized. The man whose name appeared in diplomatic correspondence, whose claim was the subject of political surveillance, whose status as former emperor provided whatever residual leverage the family possessed in negotiations with supporters and governments. With Karl gone, that architecture had to be rebuilt around different realities. The dynastic claim passed to Otto, who was 9 years old, a child, a minor, a boy, who was simultaneously the focus of his mother's protective love and the symbol of a political inheritance that half of Europe's governments regarded with suspicion or indifference. The political significance of the family diminished sharply in the eyes of the governments that had monitored them, because a child claimant under the guardianship of a widow was less threatening than a living emperor with a record of restoration attempts. The financial situation, already precarious under Karl, became more precarious still, because whatever residual authority Karl's status had carried in dealings with benefactors, aristocratic networks, and Catholic institutions now had to be exercised by a 30-year-old widow on behalf of a 9-year-old heir. Zita's transformation in the hours and days after Karl's death was not a transformation of character. She had always been formidable, always disciplined, always the household's operational center, but a transformation of role so total that it amounted to a transformation of identity. She was no longer the empress beside the emperor. She was the empress alone. And the word empress, in the context of a borrowed villa on an Atlantic island with no empire to answer to, meant something simultaneously grand and absurd, both everything and nothing. She had always been the person who managed, decided, directed, and maintained. Now she was also the sole authority, the final word, the person who would determine where the family lived, how the children were educated, what money was spent on what, which supporters were cultivated and which were kept at a distance, and how the dynasty's claim would be preserved through the decades that no one yet knew were coming. There was no husband to consult, no emperor to defer to in matters of dynastic strategy, no partner to share the weight of decisions that affected 8 children and the survival of a name that half of Europe had once recognized as sovereign. She was the widow, she was the mother, she was the guardian, she was the regent in all but legal title. And the work that lay ahead of her, the decades of exile still to come, the country still to cross, the children still to raise and educate and marry, the household still to hold together against every material and political force that sought to dissolve it, was work that she would do essentially alone, sustained by the faith that had been built into her since childhood, by the discipline that had become indistinguishable from her personality, and by the love for her children that was, in the end, the one force stronger than the dynasty's abstract demands. The household began its second life, not immediately, not with any ceremony or declaration or formal acknowledgement of the change, but in the quiet, practical way that households always reorganize after a death. The routines adjusted slightly, the responsibilities redistributed among the remaining staff, the absent person's place at the table noticed every morning and not discussed. The children adapted because children adapt, and because the governesses and the household's deep culture of emotional discipline gave them a framework within which to process a grief that was enormous, but that the family's code required them to carry without visible collapse. Otto became more noticeably the heir in the days after his father's burial, his bearing changing in small ways that the adults around him encouraged, and that he himself at 9 was probably not fully aware of. A straightening of the shoulders, a gravity in his manner, the beginning of the long process by which a boy would be converted into a political symbol. Adelheid grew quieter, more inward, more observant, the beginning of the intellectual withdrawal that would eventually lead her towards scholarship and away from the dynastic drama that consumed her family. The younger children continued to need what young children always need: attention, warmth, food, sleep. The reassurance that the world around them would not fall away. And the women of the household provided it with the same tireless devotion they had shown since the exile began, because providing it was what they had always done, what they were trained to do, and what they would continue to do across the years in the continents and the borrowed houses that lay ahead. Elizabeth was born on May the 31st, 1922, less than 2 months after Karl's death. She was delivered on the island of Madeira. Some accounts placed the birth in Spain, where the family would soon relocate, but the timing and the circumstances matter more than the precise geography, because what matters is the meaning. She was the posthumous child, the daughter who would never know her father, the 8th life, produced by a marriage that had ended in a borrowed house on an Atlantic island. Her birth was both a beginning and a kind of completion, the last physical legacy of Karl and Zita's union, arriving into a household that had already begun the long, painful process of learning to exist without the man who had given it its original purpose and its public identity. Elizabeth would grow up inside the exile culture that her mother built with such fierce discipline, absorbing its routines and its silences and its insistence on continuity, and she would carry into her own adult life the particular emotional inheritance of a child who enters a family at the moment of its greatest loss. The sense, never fully articulable, that one's existence is both a gift and a reminder of an absence that can never be filled. She would never remember a time when her father was alive. She would never know the empire as anything other than a set of stories and expectations maintained by a mother in black. She would know only the afterlife, the reconstructed household that Zita would maintain across Spain, Belgium, Canada, and the United States, and the afterlife would be the only world she had. Zita was 29 years old. She was the mother of 8 children, the youngest born weeks after the father's death. She had no country that would have her without conditions. She had no reliable income and no prospect of one. She had no husband, no protector, no partner in the work that every day demanded of her. She had a name that half the governments of Europe wished would quietly disappear from public memory, and a conviction, unyielding, absolute, rooted in faith and formation, and the sheer stubbornness of a woman who had been taught since childhood that legitimacy does not expire, that it must not. The world she had been raised to inhabit was gone. The cord that had given her role, its meaning was dissolved. The man she had been raised to stand beside was buried in a church on an island she had never chosen to visit, in a grave she could not move, in a country that was not hers. And the question that would define the next 67 years of her life, the question of whether a dynasty could survive the death of everything except the women who carried its memory, whether a family could hold together across decades and continents, and the slow, grinding erosion of relevance and resources and hope, was now hers, alone to answer. She had 8 children who needed her. She had a household that depended on her. She had a faith that told her God had not abandoned the covenant simply because the earthly powers had revoked it. And she had the black silk she would wear every day for the rest of her life, the visible sign of a grief and a loyalty that would outlast every government, every border, and every diplomatic arrangement that the 20th century could produce. She would answer the question in that silk, and the answer would take her across the world, and the answer began in Spain. After Karl's death, the family could not remain on Madeira indefinitely. The island had been imposed as a place of exile for a living emperor, not as a permanent home for his widow and children, and the practical question of where the family would go next had to be resolved quickly, because the household's resources could not sustain a prolonged stay in a place with no income, no community, and no institutional support. The Spanish royal network provided the first solution. King Alfonso III's government, connected to the Habsburgs through the dense web of Catholic dynastic alliance that still linked Europe's surviving and former monarchies, offered refuge. Zita and the children moved to Villa Uribarren in Lequeitio, a coastal town in the Basque Country, in the summer of 1922. The house was adequate, the town was quiet, the climate was gentler than Madeira's mountain damp, and for the first time since Karl's death, the household had something that resembled stability. Not the stability of a home, because they had no home, but the stability of a place where the immediate crisis of survival was not the first thought of every morning. At Liquidio, the widow-led household took the shape it would maintain, with local variations, for the next 2 decades. The routines hardened into a discipline that was both impressive and quietly confining. Mass every morning, attended by the entire household, the children kneeling in order of age beside a mother whose black clothing announced, before any word was spoken, that the household existed under the sign of a loss that would not be set aside. Lessons for the children followed Mass. Languages: German, French, Italian, Hungarian, and eventually Spanish, alongside history, mathematics, catechism, and the dynastic knowledge that Zita considered as essential to her children's formation as arithmetic. The governesses maintained their roles with a professional dedication that had not diminished since the days when they had served in imperial nurseries, adapting their methods to the resources available, but never lowering the standards that the household's culture demanded. The remaining staff, smaller now, fewer hands for more work, performed their reduced functions with the dignified resolve of people who had stayed because they believed in the family or because the family was the only world they had left. Zita presided over everything with the composure and the authority of a woman who had decided that the household structure was the dynasty's last surviving expression, and that therefore the structure could not be allowed to falter. Not for a day, not for a meal, not for a single lapse in the forms of a dress that reminded the children who they were. The children were not raised as ordinary refugees or as the children of a fallen house, content to blend into their surroundings and start again. They were raised as Habsburgs, specifically, deliberately, with the full weight of that identity pressed into their daily lives. Titles were used in conversation, forms of address were observed between siblings, and between the children and the household staff. The children were taught the full history of their dynasty, the 6 centuries, the territories, the marriages, the wars, the covenant with God, with the earnestness that a reigning house would have brought to the education of its heirs. and the expectation that shaped every lesson and every prayer and every corrected posture was never stated as a hope. It was stated as a certainty. The exile would end. The world would recognize the family's legitimacy, and the children must be ready when that recognition came. That certainty sustained the household. It also prevented it from grieving what had been lost, because grief implies acceptance, and acceptance was the one thing the family's code forbade. In 1929, the family moved again, this time to Ham Castle at Steenokkerzeel near Brussels in Belgium. The move marked a shift in the exile's emotional register that was as significant as any border crossing. Belgium was not a temporary refuge arranged in haste after a death or a political crisis. It was a settled location, a place where the family intended to stay for an extended period, and the settling brought with it a psychological complication that the earlier, more urgent stages of exile had managed to avoid. The slow, corrosive acknowledgement, never spoken aloud but increasingly present in the household's atmosphere, that the exile might not end in the way the family had always insisted it would. At Steenokkerzeel, the fantasy of immediate restoration faded into something longer, more ambiguous and more psychologically demanding. The task of maintaining a dynastic identity across years that offered no sign of the vindication the family had been promised by its own faith. The children grew. At Steenokkerzeel, they passed from childhood into adolescence, and from adolescence into the beginnings of adulthood, each of them absorbing the family's code in different ways and beginning to develop the individual trajectories that would carry them. Eventually, out of the household and into lives the old dynasty could never have predicted. Otto was educated with particular rigor and expectation, his mother's investment in his preparation growing more intense as the years passed without restoration. He studied law and political science. He learned languages. He was groomed for a public life whose form had not yet been determined. It might be restored monarchy. It might be something else. But whatever it was, he would be ready. Adelheid pursued her studies with the quiet intellectual seriousness that had characterized her since the Madeiran years, a seriousness that was pulling her temperament away from the household's ceremonial concerns and toward a more analytical, more academic engagement with the world. Charlotte, growing through her teenage years, displayed the practical orientation that would later take her to East Harlem, an impatience with abstraction, a desire to be useful, a temperament better suited to action than to the waiting that defined so much of the family's exile. The younger children, Felix, Carl, Ludwig, Rudolf, Robert, Elizabeth, each found their own accommodation, with some mythology they had inherited, some more comfortably than others, all of them shaped by the fundamental experience of being raised as members of a dynasty the world had decided no longer existed. The Belgian years produced the family's second great refugee crisis, and it arrived with a violence that dwarfed anything the polite diplomatic expulsions of 1919 and 1921 had inflicted. On May the 10th, 1940, Germany invaded Belgium. The Habsburgs were in immediate danger. Otto had been an outspoken opponent of the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in 1938, and the family's Catholic legitimism placed them in direct ideological opposition to the regime. The Gestapo had the family on its lists. There was no time for managed departures, no Colonel Strutt to oversee a dignified withdrawal, no diplomatic negotiation about where the family might be permitted to go next. The German advance was fast and the danger was real, and the household had to move immediately. Zita, now 47 years old, gathered what could be gathered. The children, no longer small, ranging from young adults to teenagers, moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had been displaced before and who understood, in their bodies, if not in their conscious reasoning, what it meant to leave a place quickly and without certainty about what lay ahead. They fled through France, across Spain, through Portugal, and eventually to the United States, following a route that traced, in reverse, the Atlantic Passage that had carried them to Madeira 2 decades earlier. The old exile story was repeating itself in a new century of catastrophe. The women were not merely fallen royals with an inconvenient name. They were refugees again, fleeing a danger that was not diplomatic embarrassment, but physical destruction. Otto, now 28 and politically active in his own right, had gone ahead to the United States to establish contacts and secure entry for the family. Zita and the younger children followed through the long, anxious route across Iberia and the Atlantic. They arrived in the United States in 1940. Later, Zita and the younger children moved to Quebec, to Villa Saint-Joseph in Sillery, so the children could continue their education in French. the language of Catholic intellectual culture, the language of Laval University, and one of the languages in which the family's displaced identity could most comfortably express itself. Quebec was one of the richest later settings in the family's long exile, because it was the place where the Habsburg daughters most visibly began to build lives that the old dynastic world could never have predicted or sanctioned. At Villa Saint Joseph, in the quiet tree lined suburb of Sillery on the outskirts of Quebec City, Zita reconstructed the household one more time. The prayers, the standards, the education, the insistence on identity, the black silk, the unbroken discipline of a woman who had been rebuilding her family's domestic life since 1919 and who now, in her 50s, was doing it again on a different continent in the middle of a different war. Charlotte studied economics at Laval University, a Habsburg archduchess, sitting in Canadian lecture halls alongside students who had no idea of her origins, absorbing the practical discipline of a subject that had nothing to do with dynasty and everything to do with the world she would actually have to inhabit. She excelled. She was serious, capable, and driven by the practical temperament that had been forming since her childhood in a household where the gap between the family's self image and its actual circumstances could only be bridged by concrete, unglamorous work. Adelheid pursued her own academic path with the intensity that had characterized her since girlhood, preparing herself for the intellectual career that would eventually take her to Fordham and a life of teaching and scholarship. The younger children continued their education under Zita's supervision, and the household at Villa Saint Joseph, modest by any standard and unremarkable to the neighbors who passed it each day, became the place where the Habsburg women demonstrated most clearly that they were not merely relics or curiosities. They were people capable of learning, adapting, and constructing lives that carried value on terms the 20th century could recognize. The individual fates stacked across the post-war decades tell the story of a dynasty that did not end but transformed, each child carrying the same inherited weight into a different kind of life. Charlotte's path was the most striking in its distance from the world she had been born into, and the most powerful in its quiet refusal to let that distance become either tragedy or farce. After the war, she moved to New York and took work in social welfare in East Harlem, one of the city's most overcrowded and underserved neighborhoods, operating under the name Charlotte DeBar, a pseudonym that concealed her origins and allowed her to do her work without the distraction of a dynasty's name. A woman whose full title included Archduchess of Austria, Royal Princess of Hungary and Bohemia, was visiting tenement apartments on the streets of Upper Manhattan, counseling families in poverty, navigating the bureaucracies of American social services, doing the practical, exhausting, unglamorous work of trying to make individual lives slightly less difficult in a city that had no idea who she was. She did this not as a performance of humility, but because she wanted to be useful. And usefulness for Charlotte meant real work with real people in real rooms. In 1956, she married Duke Georg of Mecklenburg, a union that moved her into another branch of European displaced aristocracy. But the years in East Harlem had already defined her in ways that no marriage could overwrite. She was the Habsburg daughter who had found her vocation not in the dynasty's mythology, but in its negation, in service that required no title and acknowledged no precedence. Adelheid's path took a different form, but expressed the same fundamental adaptation, the same refusal to let the dynasty's collapse define her as a victim rather than as a person with work to do. She completed her studies in social and economic sciences, pursued graduate work with the disciplined rigor that had characterized her since childhood, and eventually secured a position teaching sociology at Fordham University in New York. She stood before classrooms of American undergraduate and graduate students and lectured on the social structures and institutional systems that shape human lives, drawing on a body of knowledge that her own family's catastrophic experience had given her a particular, intimate, irreplaceable authority to teach. She understood institutions from the inside. She had watched one of the most elaborate institutional systems in European history collapse around her when she was 4 years old, and she had spent her entire adult life studying why such systems succeed and fail. She never married. She lived quietly in New York, intellectually serious, devoted to her students and her research, carrying her Habsburg identity not as a public performance or a claim to privilege, but as a private inheritance that informed her thinking without dominating her public life. She died in 1971 at the age of 57, having built a career that the old court could not have imagined and that the modern world recognized on its own terms. Elizabeth, The posthumous child, who had entered the family at the moment of its greatest loss, married Prince Heinrich of Liechtenstein in 1949 and built a life that was quieter and more private than her older siblings, but no less shaped by the exile that had produced her. She raised children of her own, passing to them whatever portion of the Habsburg inheritance she chose to share. She inhabited the world of minor European aristocracy that still existed in the post-war decades, a world of reduced circumstances, maintained courtesies, and marriages that connected one displaced house to another in a network of shared experience. She carried the particular burden of being the daughter born into absence, the child who never knew her father, who never knew the empire, who entered the family's story at the point where grief and continuation became indistinguishable. Otto's trajectory was the most publicly visible and the most symbolically significant of all the children's paths. He did not become a restored emperor. The restoration that Zita had spent decades preparing him for, that she had educated him for with such fierce, unwavering discipline, that she had organized much of her widowhood around, never came. The world moved on. The successor states consolidated. The Cold War reshaped Europe's political geography in ways that made the Habsburg claim not merely impractical, but conceptually obsolete. Instead of becoming a sovereign, Otto became a European politician, a member of the European Parliament, an advocate for European integration and the reunification of the continent that his family's empire had once, in its own imperfect way, held together. He married Princess Regina of Saxe-Meiningen in 1951 at a ceremony in the French city of Nancy, and together they raised a family that carried the Habsburg name forward into a world that Otto's grandmother could never have imagined. His path represented the most visible form of the adaptation that all the children, in their different ways, had undergone. The conversion of inherited authority into earned relevance, the transformation of sovereignty claimed by blood into influence exercised through democratic participation and intellectual engagement. It was not what Zita had planned. It was not the vindication she had spent her life insisting would come, but it was, in its own quiet way, a form of the continuity she had fought so hard to preserve. The dynasty's meaning surviving not in the form of a restored throne, but in the form of a family that refused to disappear. Zita herself lived through all of it, every adaptation, every departure, every compromise that she had refused to call a compromise. She watched her children grow and scatter and build lives across Europe and North America. She watched the dynasty's political claim fade from an urgent diplomatic question to a historical curiosity discussed in academic seminars and monarchist commemorations. She moved from Quebec to Tuxedo Park in New York, then to Luxembourg, then to Zizers in the Swiss canton of Graubünden, each move a further station in a life that had been defined by movement since the morning she walked out of Schloss Eckartsau in March 1919. She wore black every day. She attended Mass every morning. She maintained her bearing, her faith, and her refusal to concede that the dynasty's story had ended with a constancy that those around her found either profoundly inspiring or quietly bewildering, depending on their own relationship to the vanished world she represented. She became, in her later years, something she had never set out to become, and something the old court culture would not have had a category for. A living relic, the last physical connection to a political order that had ceased to exist before most of the people around her had been born. A woman whose presence in her room evoked not a government or a policy, but an entire civilization that had been swept away by a war she had lived through and a century she had outlived. The cultural afterlife of the Habsburg exile story was and remains thinner in mainstream English language prestige drama than the fame of the dynasty might suggest, and that absence is itself worth noting. The Habsburgs have not received the sustained dramatic treatment that the British monarchy has enjoyed through programs and films. The story has been remembered, but it has been remembered primarily in biography, in archival Austrian documentary work, and in the commemorative culture of Catholic monarchism. Gordon Brooke Shepard's biography, published as The Last Empress in 1991, remains a central reference point for Zita's life. The Austrian broadcaster ORF has returned to the family repeatedly in documentary form. But the daughters' stories, Charlotte in East Harlem, Adelheid at Fordham, Elizabeth carrying the weight of a father she never knew, have never been absorbed into mainstream popular culture in the way that some British or even some Russian dynastic collapses have been. The story is there, the women are there, the drama is there. It has simply not yet found the production that would bring it to the audience it deserves, and that gap between the richness of the material and the thinness of its dramatization is one of the reasons the story feels so fresh when it is finally told in full. The late reversal came in Austria itself, and it came from a direction that no one in the family could have anticipated. For decades, the Habsburg Law had barred Zita and her family from the country. The dynasty that had ruled Austria for 6 centuries was legally prohibited from entering it, a formal legislative exile imposed on top of the political and geographic exile that had begun in 1919. The prohibition was not merely bureaucratic, it was ideological. The young Austrian Republic's assertion that the old order was finished, that its representatives were not welcome even as private citizens, and that the new state's identity required the permanent exclusion of the family that had embodied the old one. Zita, who had never accepted the legitimacy of the republic that had expelled her family, who had never signed any document acknowledging the end of the dynasty's sovereignty, who had spent 6 decades maintaining the posture and the conviction of a woman waiting for a vindication that the world had stopped expecting, lived under this prohibition for more than 60 years. And then, in 1982, on the initiative of the Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky, a social democrat, a man whose political tradition had been among the most determined opponents of the Habsburg Restoration, the prohibition was eased. Zita was permitted to return to Austria. She crossed the border as a woman of 90, in the black she had worn since 1922, entering a country that had changed beyond recognition since the morning she had left it on a train from Eckertso 63 years earlier. She did not return as empress. She did not return with any political expectation or any public demand. She returned as an old woman visiting the country of her marriage and her widowhood, and the reception she received, the crowds, the attention, the emotional recognition from a public that had never known her as anything other than a historical figure, was one of the most extraordinary moments in the family's long post-imperial story. Austria had not restored the monarchy. It had not reversed the Habsburg Law in its entirety, but it had allowed the woman who had carried the dynasty's memory through 7 decades of exile to come home. And in doing so, it had acknowledged something that no legislation could fully suppress, that the old world, however thoroughly abolished, had left a mark on the country's memory that time alone could not erase. What remains of the dynasty the women carried is scattered across geography and memory, across countries and centuries, in places that range from the monumental to the modest. Schloss Eckertshau, where the family spent its last months on Austrian soil, is now a public heritage site managed by the Austrian Federal Forest, open to visitors who walk through the paneled rooms and stand in the chapel where Mass was said during that first winter of exile. The lodge has been restored. The furniture has been arranged to evoke the period. Tourists photograph the rooms, where an empire drew its final domestic breath, and move on to the next item on their itinerary, most of them unaware of the women who packed the trunks and dressed the children and maintained the forms of a dress, while the state that gave those forms their meaning dissolved around them. Karl is still buried on Madeira, at the church of Nossa Senhora do Monte, his grave tended and visited by pilgrims and monarchist devotees. His cause for beatification was opened by the Catholic Church, and he was declared blessed by Pope John Paul II in 2004, a designation that transformed the last Habsburg emperor from a political figure into a religious one and gave his grave a significance that transcends the dynasty itself. Villa Uribarren in Lequeitio, where the widow-led household first reconstituted itself in the summer of 1922, has been converted into a hotel where guests sleep in rooms that once sheltered a displaced empress and her 8 children. Villa Saint Joseph in Sillery, where Zita and the children lived through the Canadian wartime years, survives as a private residence. The present head of the House of Habsburg is Karl von Habsburg, born in 1961, the grandson of Karl and Zita, a man who carries the family name in a 21st century Europe, where it denotes heritage and history rather than sovereignty or political authority. And in a striking recent coda to the long saga of the family's displaced wealth, Habsburg jewelry once thought lost. Pieces connected to the decades of secrecy and exile, including items linked to Zita's years of displacement, emerged in 2025 through family and museum disclosures tied to Canada. The objects had outlasted every government, every border, and every diplomatic arrangement that had shaped the family's century of exile. They were the last material proof that the women had carried more than memory across those borders and decades. They had carried the physical remnants of a dynasty in their luggage, in their wardrobes, in the hidden places where exiles learn to keep the things they cannot bear to surrender and cannot afford to display. Zita died on March the 14th, 1989, at the age of 96. She died in Ziesers, in the Swiss canton of Graubünden, in a country she had first entered as an exile 70 years earlier aboard a train from Eckertsau. She had outlived the Austro-Hungarian Empire by 7 decades. She had outlived every government that had expelled her. She had outlived Karl by 67 years, wearing black for every one of them. Her body was brought to Vienna for funeral rites at St. Stephen's Cathedral, and the ceremony that followed became one of the most remarkable public events in the city's post-war history. Vast crowds gathered along the route. Estimates placed the number in the tens of thousands, an extraordinary turnout for a woman who had been constitutionally barred from the country for most of her life. The streets were lined with people who had never known the empire, who had been born into the republic, who had no political investment in the dynasty's claims, but who recognized in the funeral of this woman in black something that transcended politics. The end of a story that had lasted longer than anyone had expected, carried further than anyone had thought possible, by a woman whose endurance had become, in itself, a kind of monument. The coffin was carried through a Vienna that had been rebuilt after the war, modernized, Europeanized, democratized, a city that bore almost no resemblance to the imperial capital Zita had left in 1918. But the crowd stood, and the cathedral filled, and the old ritual was performed one final time. She was buried in the Capuchin crypt, the Habsburg burial vault, the resting place of emperors and empresses for centuries, the place from which Karl had been permanently separated by the circumstances of his death on Madeira. After 67 years of exile, 67 years of black silk and morning mass, and the fierce, unbroken insistence that the dynasty's meaning had not expired with the dynasty's power, Zita was laid to rest among her predecessors. Karl was not beside her. He remained on his island, in his church above Funchal. But the woman who had carried his memory, and the memory of everything he had represented, and the burden of raising 8 children to carry that memory forward, was finally where the family's code had always told her she belonged. The Habsburg women did not inherit an empire. They inherited the labor of carrying its remains, children to raise across borders and languages, objects to hide and preserve, rituals to maintain in borrowed rooms, names to defend before governments that wished those names would disappear, grief to discipline into posture, prayer, and the daily performance of a continuity that the world had declared finished. There is no neat lesson in any of it. The empire did not return. The sacrifices did not produce the restoration that justified them. The daughters scattered into lives the court could never have imagined. A sociology lecturer in New York, a social worker in East Harlem, a wife and mother in Liechtenstein, a European politician's mother in Brussels. What remains is not a dynasty in any functional sense. What remains is the image of Zita, once driven from Austria under the post-imperial order, returning in old age to a city that had outlived her monarchy, but had not, in the end, forgotten her face. The empire did not come back, but the woman who carried its memory did, and the women who came after her carried it further still into lives that were ordinary and extraordinary and shaped, every one of them, by the weight of a name that would not let them go.